Working together, we can put an end to this cycle that creates deep pain in the hearts of our mothers, our fathers, and our people who have lost loved ones to this senseless violence.
San Quentin State Prison, December 13, 2005, 12:01 in the morning. A man walks into a small, pale-lit room wearing a blue shirt, blue jeans, and no shoes. Just socks on the cold floor. He lies down on a padded green gurney without resistance. Guards secure the straps across his chest, his arms, his legs. A nurse searches his left arm for a vein. She cannot find one. She tries again. He lifts his head off the gurney, looks directly at the technician and asks, "Are you doing that right?" Outside the prison walls, 2,000 people are standing in the December cold. Inside, separated by a pane of glass, are the families of 4 people who never came home from work. It takes 12 minutes to place the lines. The first drug is administered at 12:21 a.m. At 12:35 a.m., a physician steps forward and pronounces the time of death. 4 people lost their lives in 1979. One man maintained his innocence for 24 years before this room. Nobody standing in that building that morning agreed on what justice looked like. That disagreement is what this documentary is about. Before this story goes any further, drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. We have people tuning in from all over the world and we want to know where you are. If you have been here before and you are not subscribed yet, that is on you. Hit the subscribe button. This channel exists for people who want the full story, not the headline. You are already here. Stay. December 29, 1953. Charity Hospital, New Orleans, Louisiana. A 17-year-old girl named Luella Williams gives birth to a son. She is barely an adult herself. No husband. No financial support. No safety net of any kind. She names the boy Stanley Williams III after his father. His father never stayed long enough to matter. Stanley Williams Jr. was gone before his son's first birthday. No goodbye. No explanation. Just absence. And that absence became the first thing that shaped the man this documentary is about. Luella did what she had to do. She worked double shifts as a nurse's aide, evenings as a housekeeper. She kept her son fed and clothed, but the hours she spent working were hours she was not home. By the time Tookie was 6 years old, he was largely raising himself. In 1959, Luella made a decision that thousands of black families were making during that period. She packed what little they owned, took her son by the hand, and boarded a Greyhound bus headed west toward California. Toward Los Angeles. Toward what she had been told was a better life. They settled near Avalon Boulevard and Century Avenue in South Central Los Angeles. Tookie would later write about that neighborhood in his memoir, describing it as a shiny red apple rotting from the inside. He attended George Washington Carver Middle School, then Sojourner Truth Junior High, then George Washington Preparatory High School. He later described his education using a word he coined himself: diseducated, diseased knowledge, incomplete preparation. A system that processed him without ever seeing him. What that system also never saw, and what IQ testing would later confirm after his death, was that Stanley Tookie Williams had a borderline genius-level intellect. His longtime advocate Barbara Becknell confirmed this publicly after his execution. The schools in South Central in the mid-1960s never identified it, never acted on it, never gave it anywhere to go. So it went somewhere else. In 1969, at 15 years old, Tookie was arrested for car theft in Inglewood and sent to Los Padrinos Juvenile Hall. Inside that facility, a gym coach handed him a barbell. He never put it down. By the time he walked out of Los Padrinos at 17, he stood 6 feet tall and carried close to 250 pounds of muscle. He had a reputation on the streets that arrived before he did. And South Central was waiting. While Tookie was finding his footing on the streets of South Central, someone else was already building something. His name was Raymond Washington. Washington had been organizing a small crew on the East Side since 1969. He called them the Baby Avenues. He was young, sharp, and ambitious, and he had been hearing one name come up repeatedly on the streets. A name connected to a reputation for taking on larger, more established crews without hesitation. That name was Tookie Williams. A mutual friend brought them together at Washington Preparatory High School in 1971. Two young men from opposite sides of the same neighborhood, sizing each other up. What they recognized in each other was not just toughness. It was direction. Both of them wanted to build something larger than themselves. They merged their networks. They called it the Crips. Original membership was approximately 30 people. What followed was a rapid expansion. Gang leaders across South Central were challenged directly. Those who lost folded their crews into the Crips as sets. Within 3 years, the Crips had become the most powerful street organization in South Central gang life. By 1978, there were 45 active Crip sets operating across Los Angeles County with an estimated 20,000 members. The growth had become so significant that rival gangs who refused to join formed their own alliance in direct opposition. That alliance became the Bloods. In 1974, Raymond Washington was convicted of robbery and sentenced to 5 years in prison. In his absence, Tookie ran the West Side Crips alone. Washington was released from prison in 1979. On August 9th of that same year, he was shot and killed in Los Angeles. No one was ever charged. The organization the two of them built did not slow down. By 1999, the Crips had an estimated 50,000 members operating across 41 states. Most of that growth occurred while Tookie was locked inside a cell he would never leave. Years later, in a written apology distributed to California schools in April 1997, Tookie stated plainly that he never imagined the Crips would spread the way they did, and that he never anticipated how many lives it would go on to destroy. By early 1979, the public feared the name Stanley Tookie Williams. What they did not know was that behind that reputation, the man himself was running out of options. He was 25 years old. The street credibility was real. The money was not. 2 years earlier, in 1977, Tookie had briefly held a position as a youth counselor. The kind of role that, on paper, suggested a different path was still possible. That position ended after he was connected to a robbery. He lost it and never replaced it. By early 1979 he had no steady income, a growing substance habit documented in court records, and a circle of associates who moved the same way he did. The substance appearing in those court records was PCP, phencyclidine, a drug well documented for distorting judgment and separating a person from the weight of consequences. Tookie was using it regularly. And on the evening of February 27, 1979, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He assembled a crew. 4 men in total. Alfred Coward, known on the streets as Blackie. A fellow gang member who moved fast and asked questions later. Bernard Trudeau, called Whitey. Quieter, more calculated, but present for everything that followed. A man named Tony Sims, who went by Bam and handled the practical side of operations. And a 4th associate identified in trial records only as Darryl, no last name ever formally established in the public record. The 4 of them climbed into a borrowed brown station wagon that evening. Before they moved anywhere, they smoked cigarettes laced with PCP. Their first stop was the home of a Crips associate named James Garrett. Tookie went inside for a few minutes and came back out carrying a 12-gauge Mossberg shotgun he had been storing there. He placed it in the vehicle and they drove. They had no fixed destination. They were looking for an opportunity. Their first stop was a convenience store, a stop-and-go market. 2 members of the crew went inside. 18-year-old Johnny Garcia was working the counter that night. The 2 men looked around, made brief contact with the clerk, and walked back out without taking any action. The location felt too exposed. Too much risk for what it might return. So they kept driving. What they found next would set off a chain of events that would eventually reach the California governor's office, the United States Supreme Court, and an execution chamber 26 years later. According to the official summary published by the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, the events at the 7-Eleven took place in the early hours of February 28, 1979, around 4 a.m. Not the evening of February 27 as some accounts have reported. They had been driving through the night for hours before they stopped. The location was a 7-Eleven at 10437 Whittier Boulevard in Whittier, California. Working the overnight shift that night was a man named Albert Lewis Owens. Albert was 26 years old. He was a United States Army veteran, having served from January 21, 1972 to March 23, 1973, with a subsequent recall to active service in 1976. He was not a stranger to structure or hard work. But by early 1979, his personal life was under significant pressure. He had recently returned to California to pursue custody of his 2 daughters. He and his wife had separated 4 years before that night. The overnight shift at the 7-Eleven was not a career. It was a necessity. A man working to stabilize his footing while fighting through the legal process for his children. His daughter Rebecca was 8 years old at the time. She would grow up without her father. She was raised with the understanding that the person responsible had already faced legal consequences. It was not until 4 years before the 2005 execution that Rebecca discovered Tookie Williams was still alive. That night, Albert Owens was outside sweeping the parking lot when the brown station wagon pulled in. According to prosecution testimony presented at trial, Tookie and Alfred Coward entered the store behind Owens while Tony Sims and Darrell approached the register. Sims and Darrell took approximately $120 from the cash drawer. Tookie directed Albert Owens toward the back storage room of the store. What happened inside that room, according to the prosecution's case, ended Albert Owens' life. He was 26 years old. The crew left the scene. At trial, Alfred Coward testified under a full immunity agreement, meaning he faced no criminal consequences for his role that night in exchange for his cooperation with prosecutors. His testimony included a claim that after leaving the store, Tookie had reacted with indifference to what had happened. Coward also testified that Tookie made racially motivated statements about why Owens had been targeted. Tookie Williams disputed every word of it. He maintained from the night of his arrest to the morning of his execution that Coward's account was a fabrication built to secure his own freedom. What made the prosecution's position harder to set aside was a separate legal development. Tony Sims faced his own trial for his role that night. And in that proceeding, under oath, with no immunity agreement protecting him from consequences, Sims independently identified Tookie Williams as the person directly responsible for what happened to Albert Owens. The sentencing judge in Sims' case formally noted on the record that Sims himself was not the person who carried out the act. Sims was convicted of first-degree murder under the felony murder rule and received a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. That identification, given under oath with no deal on the table, became one of the most consequential pieces of testimony across the entire case. Less than 2 weeks after Albert Owens lost his life, Tookie Williams was connected to a second location across south-central Los Angeles. This time, 3 people would not come home. The Brookhaven Motel sat at 10411 South Vermont Avenue in south-central Los Angeles. It was not a large operation. It was never meant to be. It was the product of years of work by a Taiwanese immigrant family who had crossed an ocean and committed everything they had to building something stable in a new country. Tsai Shai-Chan Yang had come to the United States from Taiwan in 1973. Her husband Yenny Yang arrived shortly after. Together they had built the Brookhaven Motel into their livelihood and their home. They had 6 children and 10 grandchildren. The motel was not just a business. It was the physical evidence that the years of sacrifice had produced something real. Their daughter, recorded in legal documents as both Yi Chin Lin and Yu Chin Yang Lan, was 43 years old. She was married with 3 children of her own, a daughter who was 10 years old, a son who was 13, and another son who was 14. She had traveled from Taiwan to Los Angeles specifically to visit her parents. A planned family visit. The kind that gets arranged weeks ahead, looked forward to by everyone involved. Her 3 children watched her leave for California. They never saw her again. Also present at the motel that night were the Yang's son, Robert Young, and his wife. They were asleep in a back bedroom. At approximately 5:30 in the morning on Sunday, March 11, 1979, the door to the motel's private office was forced open. 3 members of the Yang family were fatally harmed inside that office within minutes of each other. Yenny Yang, Tsai Shai-Chan Yang, and Yi Chin Lin all passed away at the scene. The cash register in the office held approximately $100. Robert Young was pulled from sleep by the sound of a disturbance, followed by his wife screaming. He moved through the motel toward the office. What he encountered when he arrived is something the court record describes but cannot adequately measure. He called 911. Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department deputies, not the LAPD, a distinction that matters to the accuracy of the record, arrived at the Brookhaven Motel within approximately 10 minutes of that call. When the deputies entered the building, they immediately began documenting what they observed. A strong odor of gunpowder was present throughout the space. The door leading from the public entrance into the Yang's private living area had been forced open with considerable force. The door jamb was split. The woodwork had been torn away from the frame entirely. These were the first formal forensic observations recorded at the Brookhaven Motel scene. A 12-gauge shotgun shell casing was subsequently recovered from the property. That single piece of physical evidence would go on to become the most examined and most contested item in the entire legal case against Tookie Williams. Robert Young gave his account to investigators that morning. He testified at the criminal trial. He testified again at sentencing. He formally opposed the clemency petition filed in 2005. He was present as a witness at the execution. For 26 years, Robert Young carried the full weight of that morning. March 11, 1979 never left him. When investigators sat down with what they had collected from 2 separate crime scenes across 2 incidents in less than 2 weeks, the picture was complicated. The physical evidence was limited. No fingerprints recovered at either location that could be connected to Tookie Williams. No footwear impressions consistent with his size 14 shoes. No confession. No independent witness who had not already been present as part of the crew itself. What investigators did have was a single shell casing. A 12-gauge shotgun shell casing had been collected from the Brookhaven Motel scene. A subsequent search of the residence belonging to James Garrett, the associate at whose home Tookie had stored his weapon, produced a 12-gauge Mossberg shotgun. Forensic analysis linked the recovered casing to that specific firearm to the exclusion of all others, according to the prosecution's expert. That connection became the spine of the physical case. It would also become the most contested point in the entire legal record. During the final round of appeals in 2005, the defense submitted a forensics expert who described the original ballistics analysis as unreliable. The California Supreme Court reviewed that argument and declined to reopen the case. The prosecution responded that the defense's position rested on supposition and the conclusions of a hired expert, not on any factual challenge to the original testing. But physical evidence was only one piece of what prosecutors carried into court. The more significant weight came from the people who had been in that station wagon. They cooperated in a specific order. Alfred Coward went first. He accepted a full immunity agreement. In exchange for his testimony, he faced no legal consequences for either night. Full immunity. What he gave in return was a detailed account of both incidents from his own perspective. Bernard Trudeau followed. He accepted a reduced charge and served 5 years as an accomplice. James Garrett and his wife Esther Garrett testified that after the second incident, Tookie had returned to their home and made self-incriminating statements about what had taken place. Then there was George Oglesby, a jailhouse informant who claimed that while in custody, Tookie had spoken openly about the crimes and described a plan to escape the facility involving explosive devices. The defense challenged all of it on the same grounds. Every prosecution witness had a direct personal interest in the outcome. Coward received his freedom. Trudeau received a reduced sentence. The Garretts were facing their own legal pressure. Oglesby was a jailhouse informant, a category of witness that courts across the country have repeatedly flagged for reliability concerns. The defense's position was consistent. Every person on that witness list had a reason to say exactly what prosecutors needed to hear. According to the Seattle Times and supporting court records, Williams was taken into custody on March 15, 1979, 4 days after the Brookhaven incident, initially on suspicion of auto theft. Murder charges were formally developed and filed through the spring and summer of 1979. The trial opened on February 10, 1981, at Torrance Superior Court. The venue was deliberate. Torrance sat at a calculated distance from South Central, away from the streets where the Williams name carried weight that prosecutors preferred to keep out of the courtroom. Judge Joan Dempsey Klein presided. The jury seated consisted of 10 white jurors, 1 Latino juror and 1 Filipino juror. There were no black jurors on the panel. Lead prosecutor Manfred Arndt had used peremptory challenges to strike 3 potential black jurors from the pool during selection. In 1981 this was legally permitted. The Supreme Court's decision in Batson v. Kentucky, which placed constitutional limits on race-based peremptory challenges, would not come until 1986, 5 years after this verdict was returned. The racial composition of that jury became a central argument in every appeal that followed. Arndt drew additional scrutiny during the proceedings when he described Tookie in open court as a Bengal tiger caged in the urban jungle. He had received formal censures for similar language in prior cases. The defense objected. The record reflects it. Defense attorneys Robert Martin and Wayne Chacoin argued their client had been identified as the responsible party because it was the most convenient outcome for everyone who had agreed to cooperate with the state. Tookie did not take the stand. A legal and strategic decision, one the jury was instructed carried no implication of guilt. For the February 28 night, the defense called Beverly McGowan, Tookie's girlfriend, who testified he had been with her through the night. Prosecutor Arndt cross-examined her and identified inconsistencies in her timeline. For the morning of March 11, stepfather Fred Hollowell placed Tookie at the Showcase Bar parking lot around 5 a.m. Eugene Riley testified he had driven Tookie home that same morning. 2 competing versions. One built on accounts from people who received legal deals. The other built on accounts from people connected to the defendant. On March 13, 1981, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty on all 4 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances. Guilty on 2 counts of robbery. The special circumstances finding meant one thing: the death penalty was now a sentencing option. At sentencing on April 15, 1981, Laura Owens addressed the court about Albert and about his daughter Rebecca, 8 years old, who still did not know the full truth about what happened to her father. Robert Young spoke about his parents, his sister, and the 3 children in Taiwan waiting for a mother who was never coming home. Judge Joan Dempsey Klein imposed the sentence. The Stanley Tookie Williams was received at San Quentin State Prison on April 20, 1981. Inmate number C29300. 27 years old. The question of whether the right man was sitting in that courtroom would follow this case for the next 24 years. Stanley Tookie Williams arrived on April 20, 1981, as inmate C29300. 27 years old. His cell measured 4.5 feet by 9 feet. 23 hours a day inside it. 1 hour of supervised yard time. And for the first several years he made that situation considerably worse. In a 2005 interview with Democracy Now!, Tookie described his own conduct during that period without softening it. His words, "Incorrigible from the moment I arrived all the way up to 1988. The institutional record supports that fully. There were multiple documented confrontations with correctional staff. On one occasion he threw a chemical substance at a guard. On another, he directed fellow inmates affiliated with the Crips to carry out an attack on another prisoner inside the facility. He made direct threats against staff members and their families. The accumulation of these incidents produced one outcome. In 1987 he was placed in solitary confinement. He would remain there for 6.5 years. A smaller cell. Near total isolation. No yard. And it was inside that space that something began to shift. Not suddenly, not in a single moment, but slowly across years of enforced quiet. He turned to 3 things. The Bible. A dictionary. A thesaurus. He read them repeatedly. He started writing. Not for any audience at first. Just writing, processing, working through what he had built, what it had cost, and what he wanted the rest of his life to stand for. He described it not as a dramatic turning point but as a slow, gradual rediscovery of conscience. In 1993, a journalist named Barbara Kottman Becknell arrived at San Quentin. Born May 30, 1950, Becknell was researching a book on the Crips and had arranged an interview with Tookie. When she sat down across from him, He redirected the conversation entirely. He did not want to be interviewed. He wanted to know if she could help him publish a children's book. He had been writing in that cell for years. He had drafts ready. He knew exactly who he was writing for. Young people in the same neighborhoods he had come from, facing the same choices, and deserving of someone who had actually lived those consequences, telling them the truth about what those choices produce. Becknell said yes. Their partnership produced a 10-book series titled Tookie Speaks Out Against Gang Violence. The first 8 books were published in 1996 through the Rosen Publishing Group and Power Kids Press. A 9th book, Life in Prison, followed in 1998. Written specifically for young readers in communities directly affected by gang activity, the series did not lecture. It reported from the inside, from someone who understood the subject with a precision no outside author could match. The series won the 2007 Prevention for a Safer Society Award for Literature. Posthumously. The books are still in classrooms and libraries across the United States today. In April 1997, Tookie distributed a written apology to California schools for his role in founding the Crips. He also created the Internet Project for Street Peace, connecting at-risk youth in California and South Africa through community center computers. 5 Nobel Peace Prize nominations followed. 4 Nobel Prize for Literature nominations. The first Peace Prize nomination came in 2001 from Swiss parliamentarian Mario Fair. Subsequent nominations were submitted by Philip Gasper, a professor at Notre Dame de Namur University. Both were open about their dual purpose. They believed the work merited recognition, and they were trying to generate enough international attention to prevent his execution. In 2005 he received a Presidential Call to Service award. Barbara Becknell stated he was the first confirmed death row inmate to receive it. A clemency petition was filed with Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger carrying 60,000 signatures. Desmond Tutu signed it. The NAACP supported it. Actor Jamie Foxx, who had portrayed Tookie in a Golden Globe-nominated film, spoke publicly in support. Rapper Snoop Dogg dedicated an album to him and rallied students behind the campaign. Laura Owens and Robert Young opposed clemency. That position had not changed in 24 years. On December 8, 2005, Schwarzenegger issued his written denial. 6 pages. 3 specific objections. The dedications in Tookie's books to figures the governor characterized as violent radicals. The continued insistence on innocence rather than acknowledgement of responsibility, and what he described as insufficient effort to reduce Crips activity through his documented connections. His exact words: "Without an apology and atonement for these senseless and brutal killings, there can be no redemption." That created a problem with no solution. Tookie said he was innocent. Clemency required remorse. He could not express remorse for acts he maintained he did not commit. He refused to say otherwise. 14 appeals across 24 years. Every court denied. On December 12, 2005, the United States Supreme Court denied the final application without comment. On December 13, 2005, Stanley Tookie Williams walked into the execution chamber wearing a blue shirt, blue jeans, and no shoes. Just socks. He lay down without resistance. A nurse searched his left arm for a vein and could not locate one. It took 12 minutes to successfully place the 4 lines. During that time he lifted his head, looked at the 17 journalists seated behind the glass, looked at his 5 supporters and mouthed words no one could hear. At one point he turned toward the technician and asked, "Are you doing that right?" First drug administered at 12:21 a.m. pronounced dead at 12:35 a.m. 51 years old. As witnesses filed out, 3 of his supporters including Barbara Becknell made a statement. The state of California just killed an innocent man. Outside, 2,000 people stood in the December dark. Here is what the record shows. The case against Stanley Tookie Williams was built on testimony from men who received either complete freedom or significantly reduced sentences in exchange for their cooperation. It rested on a single ballistics match that a forensics expert later described as unreliable. There were no fingerprints connecting him to either scene. No confession. No independent witness who was not already part of what happened that night. That is the foundation on which a death sentence was carried out. At the same time, The man sitting in that cell produced 10 books that are still in classrooms across this country today. He reached young people in communities that most institutions had already written off. He received 5 Nobel nominations. 60,000 people, including a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, signed their names to the position that the system got this one wrong. And then there are 4 people who never came home. Albert Owens, whose daughter Rebecca grew up without her father and spent years not knowing the full truth of what happened to him. Yenny Yang, Tsai Shai-chan Yang, and Yi Chen Lin, whose 3 children in Taiwan watched their mother board a flight to California and waited for a return that never came. Those families never had the option of treating this as an abstract debate. For them it was never theoretical. It was permanent. Governor Schwarzenegger said without atonement there can be no redemption. Tookie Williams said he had nothing to atone for. Both of those positions were held completely and consistently until the end. They cannot both be satisfied. They cannot be reconciled. And no court, no petition, and no execution resolved the space between them. That is where this case has always lived. Where do you stand on it? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if this documentary gave you something to think about, subscribe. Because the next case on this channel carries the same weight. And it deserves the same attention.